Let's do a U.S. Senate election prediction. We'll get started with the likely states and end with the tilt. For the first likely red state, we have the state of South Carolina. I'm going to put that in the likely red column. Generally, this state is in the safe red column, but because 2026, this November, is shaping up to be a good election year for Democrats, I think it's very possible the state could narrow up into the likely red column. That's going to be the call there. And then we have Montana, kind of in a similar vein to South Carolina, generally in the safe red column. However, neither party has incumbency advantage. The incumbent Republican is retiring. Montana and another state that we'll get to later, Nebraska, are in a bit of an interesting situation. As you can see here with the independent ratings in the purple, these two states have the potential to elect independents. Interestingly enough, though, I think Nebraska is far more likely than Montana. In Montana, there's a Democrat and an independent running, last I heard, and I think that will result in some vote splitting. So that's going to be the call there. We'll get to Nebraska later, but Montana, going to put that in the likely red column. And then we're going to head over, I think that'll be the end of the likely red states. We'll do the likely blue now. We have the state of Minnesota. Going to put that in the Democratic Party's column. The state has had a pretty long history of voting blue. It's done that for quite a while, so I don't think anything will change this November. That is going to be pretty much a solid seat for the Democrats, 44 to 45. That's going to be the end of the likely blue. We'll move over to the lean red. We have a few in this column. I hinted at the state earlier, but Nebraska, going to put that into the lean red column. The state generally votes by a solid red margin on the presidential level. Well, they have a bit of an interesting system on the presidential level, but on the Senate and gubernatorial level, generally they elect Republicans by a pretty big margin. There is an independent, like I mentioned, went briefly with Montana. In this case, Dan Osborne is running as an independent, and he is hoping to win the state. He ran 2 years ago for the other U.S. Senate seat. However, he ultimately fell short then, but his chances are looking better now with the national environment favoring Democrats. Even though he's not a Democrat, he's basically the de facto Democratic candidate. And I think the Republicans are somewhat nervous about this seat, which is why I'm going to put it, but I still think at the end of the day, it'll still be a Republican victory. So I'm going to put that in the light lean red column there. Then we have Iowa, kind of a similar story here. In this case, a Democrat is running, traditional Democrat versus Republican, but I'm going to put it with the same rating. Iowa, Ohio, Florida, and Florida used to be some of the most competitive swing states, and they were kind of a bellwether to see which way the country was leaning. I think each of these states are going to be in the lean red column, except for Ohio. We'll come back to Ohio. But as far as Iowa and Florida go, going to put those two in the lean red column. Nothing too crazy there. That's going to be the call. And then we're going to go with the lean blue seats. There's going to be a couple of these. Starting out with the one I feel the most confident in calling, that being Georgia. Georgia, Democrats are defending home territory here. There's a Democrat named Jon Ossoff, who's the current Democrat incumbent senator. I think he will do fairly well in his reelection bid, and well enough to even win Georgia by a margin more significant than Tilt, which is very impressive. Georgia, as well as North Carolina, are both competitive states. So the fact that a Democrat can win both of these by a more competitive margin would be a impressive feat for the Democrats. So that's going to be the call there in Georgia and North Carolina. Then we have New Hampshire. I actually mentioned New Hampshire before Georgia. I feel very confident in calling this for the Democrats. That's going to be the call there. Nothing too crazy there. And then Maine, this state, I last had it in the Tilt blue column. It looks like the scandal that impacted the Democratic nominee in this race hasn't been too impactful yet. The polling still seems to have him beating Susan Collins, the Republican. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But for now, that's going to be the call there in Maine. And then the rest of these last four states will be in the Tilt red or Tilt blue column. We'll start with Tilt blue. I think if Republicans are going to flip a seat, it would come with the state of Michigan. This state, I think, will be a Democratic victory at the end of the day, but I do think it's going to be closer than Democrats are hoping. It's going to be the call there in Michigan. And then Alaska, going to put that in the Democratic Party's column. This state, I think, has a real potential to stay Republican. Mary Peltola, however, is a strong Democratic nominee. I think she'll do well. I just don't not certain if she'll do well enough, but at the moment I think that she will win the race. The betting markets seem to agree with me on this. A bit of an interesting side note: the betting markets, as you can see here, have Republicans with the edge at about 55% of likelihood of winning the Senate. That's for a couple of reasons. For one, Republicans only need to get to 50 seats to hold the Senate, where Democrats need to get to 51. They're definitely fighting an uphill battle, but that's going to be the call there in Alaska, which will help significantly for the Democrats. And then we have Texas. Texas, I think in the long run, will become a Democratic state. First, it'll become purple, and then I would guess eventually blue. I think it might take a while, but that's going to be the call there in Texas. One more Senate seat for the Republicans. And then Ohio is kind of ultimately going to be the state that determines control of the Senate, which party controls. I've gone back and forth, but for now, I think I'm going to go with Tilt Blue. The state, the betting markets seem to agree, even though the betting markets say on the Senate national-wide level that Republicans have the edge. In the Senate race in Ohio, Democrats have the edge in the betting markets. So it's a bit of an interesting dichotomy there. But that's going to be the call there in Ohio. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.